Hi, welcome to the video. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm talking about the importance of communicating sexually. So I think that sex and the taboo around talking about it is an interesting topic. I was in a romantic relationship communication course, where sexual communication and communicating sexually came up because it was a chapter. And I thought, it's really interesting because sex is such a big part of life. It's such a big part of history, and it's such a big part of all of our relationships. So why are we afraid to talk about it? These are questions that I was like, this is crazy that we don't talk about this more. But it makes sense because it's uncomfortable, it's vulnerable, and nobody really wants to say things that reveal the innermost self of our beings unless we trust somebody and love them. So I wanted to look more into this. By doing so, and to do so, I looked into some scholarly articles through Walker Library. I found 3 articles. One of them broke down multiple different relationships, types of relationships, longevity of relationships, and then analyzed how communicating sexually affected those relationships. From this study, I learned that relationships are greatly benefited, as you might guess, from communicating sexually. So, from this study, it says that relationship and sexual satisfaction is greatly benefited from communicating sexually. So that means that we should probably do it because it's going to help the relationship all around in the sex and in how we interact in our day-to-day lifestyle. My second article discussed the difference between conflict in a regular style and a regular mannerism about unloading the dishwasher or taking out the trash, and then conflict around sex and how we handled those discussions. And it found that conflict around everyday things were more likely to be less loving and compassionate, and we want to win those like they're battles. Whereas conflict and discussions that have to do around sex, whether we be a man or a woman, are more likely to be loving and accepting and open to what our partner or the person that we're involved with is talking about, because we see vulnerability and we give vulnerability. So it's important to realize that, one, sexual communication is extremely beneficial for a relationship, and the relationship and the sexual satisfaction, and then that people are likely to accept and still love you when you talk about things that are uncomfortable and that make you vulnerable. The third study had to do with long term. It had to do with marriages, and it talked about how sex might make up for communication in a relationship, and how if a couple is having good enough sex or regular enough and they're communicating on that, it might make up for the communication that flaws in other aspects of their marriage. And by the end of this study, it kind of came to the conclusion that that's not really the case. Although it is very beneficial, sexual communication cannot be the only thing that a couple has. So I found this one to be interesting because it still supports the fact that sexual communication does help the relationship as a whole, but it can't be the only thing. So I think it's important to remember that just interpersonal and regular communication skills are needed throughout the whole thing as a foundation, so that we can talk about the deeper, more personal, vulnerable, uncomfortable topics such as sex. So off of that scholarly articles, I wanted to find my own research. So I did interviews over the phone, about 5 minutes apiece, with 12 different people. 6 of those were men, 5 of those were women. 7 of those were men, 5 of those were women. So it was predominantly men because it's a little uncomfortable, even for me as a person conducting this research, to talk about it. I thought that was ironic that me researching about the discomfort that people have on sexual communication, I still felt discomfort talking about sexual communication. So kind of comedic there, in my opinion. But these 12 people gave me a really interesting response, especially the men and especially the women. There were some outliers, some people that were exceptions, but generally the thing that I found is that people think that it's easier to communicate sexually in long-term relationships, just as the third study found. So just about every participant said that in a long-term relationship, they were willing to break that barrier and go into that uncomfortable topic. And I think that this is because the love and the trust and the vulnerability has been built in other facets of life and other facets of their aspects of their relationship. So they get to the sexual and they're like, oh, we can talk about this. We're willing, we're honest, we're open, and we have that ability. Whereas I found some other people who didn't know how to say that. They felt like they just were there to perform. And they didn't know how to say, I really don't want to have sex this often, or I really am not into this. And it's because I'm really stressed at work, or I'm really stressed at school. I have too many things going on, so I just don't have the energy and time. So I related this to an interpersonal communication flaw. These people, there were 2 or 3 of them out of the 12 who it seemed like they just really didn't know how to say like their needs and to communicate not so much their sexual needs, but just like, this is what's going on with me. So I can consider that an interpersonal flaw. Another gentleman that I interviewed, he said that he just didn't know how to say, like, you know, what he needed, and he didn't feel comfortable to do that. A very large portion of this is nobody really feels comfortable to do it. From the oldest person that I interviewed, which was a 73-year-old man, to the youngest person, which was a 20-year-old man or woman, everybody says it's uncomfortable. But also in there, everybody that I interviewed said that, like, once you talk about it, it's easier to talk about it, and it's always beneficial for the relationship. One woman I talked to who was in her 50s, she said that if you don't talk about it, you don't really have a relationship, especially since sex is such a big thing, such a big part of a relationship. If you're not communicating sexually, your relationship's kind of failing. I found that to be really interesting. And I found it to be really interesting that people, the general consensus was that people either didn't know how to talk about communicating sexually, or they didn't want to offend somebody. So one gentleman I interviewed, he said with his partner, he didn't want to say, hey, I can't have sex this much because I have a chemistry class, a car detailing. He does all these different things, and he doesn't want to not show out. He wants to give to his partner and to show love, because that's such a big way that we show love and connection. But we've got to be able to set boundaries. I talked to 2 or 3 people that are married, and they talk about, like, we really have to set boundaries and expectations. The word expectations kept on coming up because as a man or as a woman, depending on our age, we're going to have expectations about what sex and about what a relationship looks like. So we need to communicate these things and say, what does sex look like to you? Or what would a sexually active relationship look like to you? And that's different for everybody, really. But the cool thing about communicating sexually is, as you talk about those things, you come to collaborations or compromises, and you work through them. And then the gentleman that I first interviewed, who was married and told me about the expectations thing, he's like, everything's on the table. What we do is everything's on the table, and then as it comes up, we talk about it amongst one another, and then we see what's likely, what are we comfortable with, and what are we uncomfortable with. I really love that he said that, because 2 or 3 other people that I talked to said that, and I think it really just boils down to, like, how able are you to communicate, and then work through conflict of, like, I don't want to do that, I don't want to try that, but I want to help you, I want to please you, I want to perform, and coming to a compromise, because it's not always easy. And it's just interesting stuff like that. But a lot of really cool input from people, and it's really so interesting to me that communicating sexually, it's like this whole subcategory of interpersonal communication, and or of romantic communication, romantic relationship communication, and we're not able to do it. So many of us are not able to do it, or it takes us a year or months at least to feel comfortable to say, like, I really can't see you on a Tuesday. It doesn't work with my schedule. It's killing me. It's making me anxious, whatever it is. Um, it's interesting that it's so hard for us to say our needs, especially when it comes down to such a base level conduct such as sex. And we need to kind of work through this. We need to change this taboo. We need to be able to talk about it with friends and family, with religious leaders and mentors, and say, with partners, and say, this is what I need, or this is what I'm worried about, or do you have any advice on this, mom, dad? Because it's going to happen. It's something that most people want. It's something that most people do. And without it, you wouldn't be here. So how can we make it so that we're doing this in an efficient, in a loving, in a comfortable, and in a healthy manner that leads towards better relationships? That's really all I got today. Thank you for listening to me. Hope you be safe. Have a great one. I'm out.